worship being our music, our singing worship, in presenting a lesson on praising God in song and worship. You know, we all realize the controversy that goes on and that's been going on for a long time between whether it's right to have instruments of music in the church or whether we should have a cappella music. The thing that I looked at in research, and then I remembered one time before I heard a very good lesson presented by Forrest on this subject, a lot better quality and a lot more in depth, but I'll try to get through this pretty quickly so that we can get into the singing. But what I found out is from the 1st century to the 7th century, pretty much all the churches were a cappella. After that, the Roman Catholic Church imported a organ into the worship services, and it was with great discussion and disagreement that happened. But I find that pretty much the introduction of organs and pianos into the worship service took place more in the 17 and 1800s, and it was still very discussed and debated. There was a lot of controversy. Even in the churches that had those instruments, there was split between where they thought it was right, where they thought it was wrong. I think, naturally we all should go to the Bible and find these things out. But as we realize that as we go through life, we find out that a lot of times mankind thinks there's a better way. And I think that's where a lot of these issues come from. When Jesus died on the cross, his new will or New Testament did away with the system of worship to God that had been in place for centuries, the Mosaical law. And with the church that Jesus died for, he established on the day of Pentecost, Christians had a whole new way of worship. The Mosaical worship system was one of a tangible, symbolic system, a schoolmaster that would prepare God's children for the coming of Jesus. And the establishment of the everlasting kingdom that he would establish with his death on the cross that would come into place on the day of Pentecost. A principle, the worship that Jesus instituted, a principle that our worship must be offered from a tender heart. Jesus said that God is spirit, and those that worship him must worship God in spirit and in truth. John 4:24. As we see here on this slide, basically there are 5 components of what was in the Christian church. There's number 1, singing, Hebrews 2:12, prayer, Matthew 6:9 through 13, preaching, Hebrews 10:25, the Lord's Supper, Matthew 26:26 through 29, and giving, 1 Corinthians 16:12. It was only when people began to substitute their own preferences for God's revealed will, their worship, Jesus condemned them and said, "In vain they worship me, teaching his doctrines and commandments of men." Matthew 15:9. And we see that continuing today. Churches seem to be more interested in seeing how many people they can bring into the doors, and not so much, they're looking more for numbers than numerical growth and spiritual growth. And they put aside the fact of how important that spiritual growth is. The primary point we learn is that those that worship God must worship him in truth. The secondary point is that instrumental music in worship is not in accordance with truth and is therefore unacceptable to the worship of God. We do have direct commands to sing praise to God and edify one another. In Colossians 3:16 we read, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, with grace in your hearts unto the Lord." Hebrews 13:15, "Therefore by him let us continually offer the sacrifice of praise to God, that is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name. I really like that phrase, that is the fruit of our lips. I think that one in some ways shows a lot and confirms that God didn't intend for us to have instruments of music. Some of those instruments would be impossible to sing if you're playing a trumpet or a other instrument like that. But what God wanted was a worship from the heart. In this new form of worship, He's showing us in everything it's spirit, to worship in spirit and in truth. In 1 Corinthians 14:15, I will sing with the spirit, I will also sing with the understanding. I think that point shows us that we do need to be students of the Word of God, so that when we do sing and we edify each other, we can also sing with the understanding of how that relates to our spiritual growth and our spiritual lives. Acts 16:25, but at midnight Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening. And I like that point. It says the prisoners were listening, and we also realize that the jailer and his family were saved that night. So that singing was teaching. They were learning too, and with hearing them sing the songs and the hymns and offer the prayers. Matthew 26:30, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. As we know, that was the night of Jesus' betrayal. And when they went out to the Mount of Olives, they had sung that song, but Jesus went out, and at this time he went through his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. It amazes me all the things he instituted that night. You know, he had a whole day without any sleep. Went in through, had the Passover dinner that night, washed the feet of the disciples and taught them to serve each other and to teach service. He also instituted the Lord's Supper, and he sang a hymn and went out. He did all these things and it said when he went into the garden, his spirit was grieved unto death. We realize how we would feel knowing what was fixing to happen to us, how it would feel trying to go ahead and incorporate and take care of all those things that he wanted to take care of in his final moments that were so important, especially the Lord's Supper. Here we have centuries later that keeps fresh in our mind the sacrifice that he made for us. And then it said he sang a hymn and went out. Hebrews 2:12, I will declare your name to my brethren in the midst of the assembly. I will sing praise to you. Romans 15:9, that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy, as it is written, for this reason I will confess to you among the Gentiles and sing your name. So here we see that, as we realize when the church first started, this was a big issue too, because up to this point the Jews felt like they were the only chosen ones of God. And as they learned with this new kingdom that Jesus had established, this new church, it incorporated people of all nations, including the Gentiles. And this is showing here that as they sing, they're confessing to the Gentiles. Ephesians 5:19, speaking to one another, psalms, hymns, spiritual songs. And it says, making melody in your heart. There again, I find it hard to believe that you can make effective melody in your heart while you're playing an instrument. Your mind's going to be on how you play that instrument, the chords or the keys or whatever. So I think that takes away from you of being able to have your mind set on what you're singing or the music. The one instrument of peace, the word alone, by which we honor God, is what we employ. We no longer employ the ancient psaltery or the trumpet or the timbrel or the flute. And that was a comment made by Clement of Alexandria, 1520 to 220 AD. This one I kind of like. It says, I have no objections to instruments of music in our chapels, provided they are neither heard nor seen. And that's amazing because that came from John Calvin, who was a founder of the Presbyterian Church. And this one also got me. The organ is the ensign of Baal, the god, the false god, Baal. And that was by Martin Luther, who was the founder of the Lutheran Church. Here we see another one. Music is science I esteem and admire, but instruments of music in the house of God abominate and abhor. Adam Clark, he's a Methodist author. I would as soon attempt to pray to God with machinery as to sing with him with machinery. Charles Spurgeon, Baptist minister and author. Musical instruments and celebrating with the praises of God would be no more suitable than burning incense, the lighting of lamps, or the restoration of the other shadows of the old law, including animal sacrifices. That was by John Calvin. The introduction of musical instrument into the church is a triumph of sensual over the spiritual. I think that's an excellent way to put it, and that was by Moses Eland. I think, and Teresa and I have visited other churches and have been at baptismal ceremonies for friends and things, and I was really quite shocked that, like a lot of denominational churches now have what they call the contemporary worship, the traditional worship, and now they even included another one called blended worship. They have 3 different types of worship. And as far as when I read the Bible, I only realize that there's one type of worship that God gave us. And we were in the tradition, I guess you'd call it the contemporary worship, where they had an actual rock band on the stage and a drummer in a glass case. And they had a young man with long hair and ripped jeans and his shirt tail out. And it was so loud that you couldn't really understand. They did have the words up on the screen, and the people were standing, and they were actually moving with the music in what I would call dancing. And I told Teresa when we left that day, I said, when I came out of that so-called worship service, I could kind of have a sense of what Moses and Joshua felt when they came down from the mountain and saw Aaron and the people dancing around the golden calf. That's what the vision I got of that so-called worship service. It's not one that I think God would be pleased with. I think it's one that those people were there to entertain themselves, and it was like going to a rock concert. The question of instrumental music in churches of Christ involves a great and a sacred principle. That principle is the right of men to introduce innovations into the prescribed worship of God. That right we utterly deny. There is no mention or example of use of instruments of music in the worship of the first century church. It is not mentioned or commanded by God in the worship of the church. It is only through the ideology of mankind thinking I will make worship better and more pleasing to the masses that has evolved into the use of pianos, organs, guitars, drums, flutes, and other types of instruments to be added into what they feel as an acceptable worship to God. I fear that they are as wrong in their assumption as Nadab and Abihu were. I think we all here agree on these issues. It's not like I'm teaching you anything new or anything that you don't already agree with me on. I wish that we could get our brothers in the other so-called denominations to come to a realization that God is the institutor of how we should worship. And we find that very simply in the Bible. Some people say the Bible is difficult to understand, but the things that are essential to our salvation, to our worship, are very clearly stated. And as a preacher that I love and adore, Johnny Ramsey, used to say you'd have to have help to misunderstand it. I appreciate this time, and I know this isn't anything that will induce or invoke somebody to think about their spiritual state, but I think anytime we come together as a group or church family and we study the Bible, we do reflect upon where our spiritual state is. And in so doing, I'd like to encourage anybody that hasn't already put on Christ in baptism. I think every time you miss an opportunity, it's a great gamble. You never are given the guarantee you've got another day. And you know, in this world, there is a tremendous number of gamblers. It's just like this situation with instruments of music. They say, well, I don't think that God would mind. Or I think that there isn't anything wrong with it. Well, you know, when we're standing or kneeling before Jesus on Judgment Day and we find out that we were wrong, that's a real big oops. That's a oops that you don't get a second chance from and that you're going to reflect on for eternity. Same way if you don't accept Christ and put him on in baptism. I wouldn't want to be in that situation on Judgment Day. So if you haven't put on Christ, I think now is a good opportunity to think about that. If you have and you haven't lived a Christian life, I think we need to think about making that right also, whether it's in a private way or a public way. So anybody who has a need, we'd ask them to come forward at this time as we stand.